Oh, great. Hi, everybody who's joining. Welcome to the webinar. Nice to see the numbers going up. Just wait, maybe just another few minutes and then we'll kick off. Oh, great to see so many of you making it today. Thank you ever so much for joining. Still going up, which is brilliant. I might just start with the intros just while everyone's joining, if that's all right. Great, so a huge warm welcome to everybody for joining our webinar, How to Use the White Rose Key Stage 3 textbooks with mixed attainment groups. I'm Katie and I'm the Secondary Publishing Director at Collins. And today I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Caroline Hamilton, who's the Managing Director of White Rose, and Ian Davis, who is the Head of Learning and Curriculum at White Rose, who are also the series editors and authors of the lovely White Rose Maths Key Stage 3 textbooks. Brilliant to have Caroline and Ian here, and I'm sure you'll all learn a lot from what they have to say about how to use the books sort of to the best ability with mixed attainment groups to get the most out of them. I think Caroline and Ian's presentation will take about sort of 30 to 35 minutes, so there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. If you do have questions, please do pop them in the chat box and we'll keep an eye on that, and then we can answer them at the end. Also, if you don't have a copy of the book or you haven't seen an evaluation pack, then we can just pop a link in the chat as well, so you can go and have a look at the samples. I think probably we're almost ready to go. Just check on the numbers. And then I think the last thing from me is just to note that we'll be recording the session so that you'll be able to share it with your colleagues and play it back later. But without any further ado, I'm really delighted to welcome Caroline and Ian and to hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Katie. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I hope you've had a great day. Myself and Ian will be sharing this presentation. So I'm going to take the first bit and then Ian will take the second part. And we do like everyone to contribute into the chat if possible. So any thoughts you have along the way, please do pop them in, or any questions, and we can answer them along the way. So we'll get started, and we're going to run through a few things in this short webinar this evening. So the first thing we're going to talk about is starting with algebra. If you have seen the books, you may have noticed that book 1 does start with algebra, which is quite unusual. So we're going to talk a little bit about the rationale about why we've done that and how that can support mixed attainment groups. Then we'll have a look at using a chapter. So we'll just have a look at the main parts of a chapter and how you might use that in the classroom. And then the last thing from me will be a little bit about differentiation by outcome and how the book also supports that when you're teaching mathematics. Then Ian will take over and have a look at interleaving. And finally, the progression of topics through the books as well. So let's get stuck in then with starting with algebra. So here you can see the contents of book 1, and you'll see those first 3 blocks there are all to do with algebraic thinking. And you're probably going to spend about 5 or 6 weeks on this content. So I just want to talk about our rationale for why we started there, because often you will find in year 7 or with book 1s of a series like this, you'd often start with place value. And you'll notice there that does come in block 4 in our textbook series. So we think, and lots of feedback from our students says that it's fresh and exciting for them to start with algebra. It really gives them that boost as they move into secondary school, that they're going to do some really meaty maths. And just to give you a bit of context, at primary school, there's just 2 weeks dedicated to algebra in the entire curriculum, which isn't a lot at all. And in those 2 weeks, there is quite a lot that needs to be covered as well. So this means that it may have been rushed at primary school, and it could have been taught by non-specialists, because as you know, many primary teachers are non-specialists. And indeed, we work with hundreds of primary schools, and often teachers really want some help and CPD surrounding algebra. So we know that many primary teachers aren't necessarily too confident with teaching this content. So when students come up, even if they have experienced it, they may have some misconceptions. And as well, especially when there's the pressure of SATs, if teachers have found they've been running out of time, this is some content that could even get skipped altogether in order to make sure they've got their secure understanding of place value and arithmetic and lots of the other content that they need to access their SATs. Secondly, just to stress, is that this block of learning, or these 3 blocks of learning, they're very much about algebraic thinking, and they're not about learning tricks and procedures. So let's take a look back at these steps, and you should see, if we delve a little bit deeper, that, for example, in the sequences block, we're not going as far as finding the nth term of sequences. It's very much about exploring, finding patterns and representing sequences, so that students can really just get a sense of what's happening, and they can just have a play about and make some predictions about what might happen with sequences. And then moving on to block 2, if we just look at the actual titles of the chapters, you can see it's broken down into very small steps. And that is one of the things that we do at White Rose Maths, is we break learning down into small steps to help students really understand what's going on. And you can see chapter 2.1 and 2.2, that is just about one-step function machines. First of all, we're inputting, and then we're working backwards. And then this will lead nicely on into understanding simple expressions. So it's really broken down for students to give them that depth of understanding throughout the blocks. And then finally, in block 3, we start looking at equations, and you'll notice that we stay within 1-step equations. We're not rushing students on to solving 2-step, because there's so much we can do with 1-step equations that maybe in the past, I know I'm guilty of this as a teacher, I will have rushed through 1-step to get onto 2-step equations. And then my students didn't have that depth of understanding, and it really unraveled later on when they were learning some harder content with algebra. So these 3 blocks are very much about algebraic thinking, and there's plenty of opportunity later in book 1, into book 2, and into book 3 to really start looking at more formal solving of equations and looking at how they're going to do that. So there's no need to formalize too much in these 3 blocks. And then finally, and this is probably what you're most interested in, thinking about mixed attainment groups, is we really feel this can help level the playing field with our students. So often it'll be brand new, and if not, as you've seen, they will have only have touched on this maybe a couple of weeks worth at primary school. And we really encourage using calculators throughout these blocks of learning as well, because many students, as you know, may come from primary school having not secured things like their times tables or their arithmetic, and we don't want that to be a barrier. So give students a calculator, get them used to using it, and this will really help free up working memory and isolate the key learning that we want them to be thinking about. And you notice I've just mentioned working memory there. So I just want to delve a little bit deeper into what we mean by working memory in case you've not come across that research before. And here's your first bit of maths to do. So what I'd like to think about is just mentally calculating 2/5 of 400, please. I'll give you a minute. So hopefully you found that okay. You were going to divide by 5 and multiply by 2 and get 160. And then can you just mentally calculate 2/7 of 400? So if you're anything like me, you probably struggle a little bit with that second one, finding 2/7 of 400 mentally. And it's obviously not because we can't find fractions of an amount. And we're all fluent in that as teachers. However, we haven't got enough working memory to hold everything in our head for 2/7 because 400 doesn't divide nicely by 7. And if you're interested in this sort of idea about what we can hold in our head, I strongly recommend looking at the work of Daniel Willingham. He's done a lot of work around working memory and how we can help students and adults retain and learn new information. So the average person has around 4 slots of working memory. And that's why we could do that first question quite easily. We probably had to do about 3 or 4 things in our heads to get the answer. But anything beyond that becomes a bit of a struggle. And indeed, students from low socioeconomic backgrounds tend to have fewer slots of working memory as well. So that can act as another barrier because they've got so many other things maybe going on in the home life that means that some of their working memory is taken up that they can't use when they're learning at school. So by isolating our key learning points, we're really giving them that better chance of learning whatever we're trying to teach. So if they've got a barrier of arithmetic, for example, but we're learning about algebra, we need to take away that barrier of, for example, dividing by 5. They may struggle to divide by 5. So give them a calculator and then they can focus on actually working out what they need to be learning. And just before I move on, someone said, when do you suggest working on their arithmetic? Well, definitely we need to work on their arithmetic. But if you're in a block like this with algebraic thinking, I wouldn't worry about it. There's plenty of other places in the textbooks that focus particularly on arithmetic, and that's the time we would suggest working on it. And also you might want to, so if timetables is an issue, you know, you might want to do that daily anyway. So we've used TT Rockstars in the past at our math schools, 3 minutes a day, and you're working on the arithmetic, but try to not mix it up with any new learning such as solving equations. Okay, we'll move on. So I just want to take a look then at this idea with an algebraic example. So a really basic equation like this, x plus 2 is equal to 10. I might be teaching this, so really simple one-step equations. And I want my students to be able to represent it, maybe with a bar model. And I want them to be thinking about the inverse. So here we're adding 2, so I want them to think about subtracting 2. And they should see that the answer is x is equal to 8. Now, I may go through an example like this or a couple of examples like this. And in the past, I've maybe given my students some simple questions. I've just been through some simple examples and I've given them some simple questions. But something always goes wrong at this point. And if you can just have a think, what do you think, or what has happened to you with equations like this, where they've been working through them? What could go wrong at this point? So with some of my classes, what would happen is some of the students would, someone's just said not doing the inverse. Some of the students will have watched my example and said, I'm going to copy Miss completely. I'm going to do it how she wants me to do it. Some of the students will just say, well, it's obvious. A is 4 because 4 and 3 is 7. B is 3. And they just start shouting out the answers or writing them down really quickly because it's so obvious they can see what the answer is. And then what they do, all they're doing really there is working out like as if it's a missing box problem. They're not working on what I want them to, which is thinking about the inverse of solving equations. So what we'd recommend is presenting questions a bit more like this. Give them a calculator and make sure they can't guess the answer. We want them to be thinking about the inverse. So we'll use larger numbers, we'll use decimals, we'll use negatives. And this really helps as well with those questions that I'm sure you've all had that, oh, can the answer be negative? Oh, can the answer be a decimal? Of course it can. So we need to be exposing students to these sorts of examples right from the beginning. And this should be absolutely fine for our low attainers, for our high attainers, for our mid attainers, because we're providing that calculator. We're not giving them a barrier of arithmetic. Now, later in this session, I think Ian might talk about how you could also use this for interleaving as well, though. So say you have got some high attainers, you might want to challenge them without a calculator. It's good practice, but just think about your students in front of you. Think about how much working memory they might be working with, and definitely be using calculators if needed for questions like this. And here's an example of how it's put into practice in the textbook. So this is an extract from that chapter in block 3, where we're solving one-step equations. And you can see right from the beginning, we're using integers, we're using decimals, we're using large numbers, we're using small numbers, so that students can't just look at them and start figuring out the answers really quickly without thinking about how they're doing it. And if you've not seen the books, you'll see these little symbols. This is encouraging students to use a bar model. And in question 2, we actually want them to draw a diagram to represent each equation as well. So everything that we do is all based around students understanding what they're doing, not following a trick or procedure. Okay, so we'll move on now to using a chapter. So I've just chosen a chapter on directed number just to let you take a look at it and see how this could be used with a mixed attainment group, how you might use it, and why it's been structured in the way it has. So here's the first part of this chapter, and you'll see that we've got examples 1 and 2 there. And they're really clearly showing that we're going to use double-sided counters for this content. So there's really clear explanations for the students to follow, or if not, a teacher could have a look at this and then emulate it themselves in their explanations. And then the first few questions, so from question 1, 2, all the way up to 5, you'll see this is very accessible for absolutely every student in your class. We're using small numbers and we're thinking about explaining and demonstrating how to add and subtract with directed number. And what we've found is not only does this help our low attainers, because it helps them understand what's going on, but it's really helpful for the highest attainers in your school, actually, because they often don't want to do this step at all. They want to cut to the chase, get a load of questions done, and they say they know what's going on. But often they'll just be remembering a technique or a procedure or a rule, because they often do have really good memories. And this will really help them actually think about what they're doing and slow them down a little bit so that they also get that depth of understanding. We often see that high attainers lower down in school whiz through the content, but they'll often come a little bit unstuck in year 11. When they're doing something really complicated with directed number, this is the thing that they'll make a mistake with, not the complicated algebra that they're trying to work with. And you'll see at question 6, this is really then where you get your key questions. We've built it up for all students in the group, and now we're checking, can they actually work some out, just basic fluency questions. So you'd want absolutely everyone in your group to definitely get here to question 6. And then as you move through the exercise, this is where it gets a little more challenging. So you might not expect every single student to do absolutely every question in this exercise. Some will finish it, and get all the way to question 11. And you can see there's some interleaving there with question 10. We've introduced algebra again, but some might just get to question 6, and that's absolutely fine. They've got to that key learning point of this chapter, and that's fine. But what we would recommend is after this exercise, there's a little feature called "What do you think?" Now, I think it's really important that not only the high attaining students or the ones that have managed to finish that exercise get onto this. So whenever you have a student that's, say, finished, I would recommend stopping the whole group and moving on to the "what do you think" questions, because it's so important for all students to be reasoning. And hopefully you can see it's still very accessible indeed. So questions 1 and 2, the main difference is they're just looking for what they've noticed and they're starting to generalize. So through question 1, they should be noticing that when they're adding a negative, that's the same as subtracting. And then in question 2, they should be noticing that A and B have the same answer, C and D do, and E and F do. So again, they're noticing, does that order matter with the symbols? So really important, I think, that the whole class have a go at this, and it can create some really great discussion as well. Now, the next part in a chapter is the consolidate and stretch sections. And I think this is where you may split the group. So if you've got some students that have maybe only got to question 6, they've had a go at the "what do you think," but they're not quite confident, you'll want to give them the consolidate exercise. And you'll see there, again, it comes back to that key learning that was in the chapter. We need to make sure they're confident, they can use counters, and then they can have a go at some fluency questions. And then the rest of the class, you might want to point to stretch. So this is where you delve in a bit deeper. Often there'll be some context questions, and there's actually some really tough questions through the textbooks in this section. I think it's important to say, though, try to not always have the same students always do consolidate and the same students always do stretch, because they could have found one topic much easier, and so they could stretch themselves on that one, or they could have come to a topic where they have found really difficult, and consolidate is the place to go. So try to either give them the option themselves or point them in the direction that you think they should be going at that stage. And then finally, just a little bit from me about differentiation by outcome. And I'm just going to use those "what do you think" questions to show you how this can work. So often you will find questions like this. So question 2, find 10 different expressions that simplify to 6p. Well, hopefully you can see how this could be taken in so many different directions depending on your students. So some students will probably find 10 fairly simple expressions, whereas others will probably find some really complex ways of getting it to simplify to 6p. And it'll be really great for them to share their ideas as a group with questions like that. And similarly here, this is from the addition block. You can see with question 3, again, very open-ended. They've got to use the digits 1 to 9. And some students will just start filling them in a random order, and they can see what total they get. Whereas others will really look for a strategy to try to get as close to 1,000 as they can. And again, that discussion will help ones that didn't have a strategy maybe have a strategy next time when they're answering a question like this. And one final example here, this is from the fractions block. So here's 2 fractions that are equivalent, and they need to write down 5 possible pairs of values that could make the statement correct. And you can see here we're prompting partner discussion, and we're prompting them to see if there's more than 5 possible pairs and what their partners have found. So there's lots there that I think are really great for mixed attainment groups that are going to have a different way in and often different ways of solving the problem. So while I stop sharing screen and let Ian share, I will just look in the chat, because actually it's been quite busy, which is nice. So I'll have a look at what questions we've been asking. So method taught in the spring term, this analogy. Yeah, right in the inverse. Oh, my chat's just disappeared.
And okay, I'll let Caroline have a look at the chat and get some answers ready for you at the end. I think I've kept up with most of the questions that have been asked so far, but there were some big ones that I have said, we'll talk about that later. Yeah, I'll let Caroline read those and get the answers for those more difficult questions ready. But moving on to my part of the presentation, Caroline's already mentioned the idea of interleaving. Now, different people mean different things by interleaving. What we're talking about in the White Rose schemes and books when we talk about interleaving is revisiting content that's already been done in a different context. So that really is really helpful to support all learners just by keeping those skills fresh and helping them to remember what they've done, keeping that retention there. It also helps to cement links between different topics. So you've done something with fractions, you're doing something with decimals, seeing that you're doing the same thing there. So particularly, a lot of people find with low attainers that things can get learned, but then tend to get forgotten. So the idea of revisiting them and revisiting them in a different context is really, really helpful for students to keep those skills fresh and make sure that things aren't as easily forgotten. In particular, though, it also can support higher attainers, well, all attainers, but I think especially higher attainers, by increasing the level of difficulty. So if you're doing something like in Caroline's negative numbers chapter that she was just looking at, you've been doing things with arithmetic. If you start bringing in some more complex algebraic expressions in there, then that's going to add to the challenge. But as well as reminding students about algebra, how expressions work, when they're like, when they're unlike, etc., you're also increasing the difficulty and increasing the challenge by doing this interleaving or bringing the negative numbers topic and the algebraic topic together. Also, it's a chance to support higher attainers to find these links, not to just point out to them, do you see that this is the same as we did in an earlier chapter, but what else, what other connections can they see? You'll also have noticed in that negative number chapter that Caroline was talking about, there was a lot of use of manipulatives, and in particular their double-sided counters. So challenging higher attainers to see the connections and how you can express expressions using manipulatives as well as using abstract form, helping them to deepen their understanding of those links as well is an important aspect. So as an example of interleaving, I've gone a little bit further into the book and looked at practice exercise 6.2a. And the main purpose of this particular exercise is in a chapter entitled The Column Method of Addition. But if I look at question 4 there, then the numbers I'm asking the students to add up, or we're asking the students to add up and to set up in the columns, we've covered that in the earlier examples and questions in the exercise. You can see I've brought in different types of decimals and I've brought in the idea of place value and fractions as well. So we're looking back to block 4, where we looked at place value, what decimals were worth, what integers were worth compared to decimals, and also block 5, fraction, decimal, and percentage equivalents. So if suddenly we're seeing 3/4 there next to 6.72, we're forcing the students to have to remember what 3/4 is as a decimal in order to be able to solve that problem. And they may not remember that, but if it's something that we can look at again, then that regular revisiting is something that will help them eventually go, yes, 3/4, 0.75, 75%, they're all the same things, rather than trying to do that just within the block on fraction, decimal, percentage equivalents. Bringing it back strengthens those ties, those connections in the brain between those different areas. Here's the very next question in that exercise. And you can see they're looking at the numbers that have been chosen for W, X, Y, and Z, 2.8, 0.28, 2.08, 8.2, all the sorts of things where errors can occur because they look similar, but they are very, very different. And again, as well as bringing the algebra back in here by the idea that we're doing substitution to create things that we need to add up, but also we need to understand place value. We need to understand how to line the numbers up in the column, and which 0 is important, which 0 is not important in terms of the calculations that we're doing and how they will affect the answers. Going further on again within that exercise, again, we get to that what do you think section that Caroline talked about that is great for everybody. So instead of just having a look at additions, we've got subtractions here. So we're making them think about that connection between the inverse operations that we really focused on a lot in that beginning algebraic block, so children understand inverses and can solve equations like this. And so we've got equality of equivalence revisited in the context of the column method for addition. Now, some children may have forgotten that idea completely. It's been a while since they've done any equations, but we preempt that because another section we have at the beginning of every chapter is the Are You Ready? So we have the Are You Ready section. Are you ready to do this chapter? And there's really clues there of the things that are going to turn up. So question 3 in the Are You Ready section at the start of this chapter 6.2 has got some very simple equations. Again, not ones that you can spot, ones where you need to do the inverse and do a little bit of work there. But that's telling the students and telling you as the teacher that later on in this chapter, we will be revisiting that topic of equations. So a little clue there. And so that's ready. So hopefully having done the Are You Ready at the beginning, they know what an equation looks like. They know that to solve an equation with a subtraction in it, they need to do the inverse operation and add. So then everyone can access that what do you think question and realize for part A, they need to add up 437 and 432 and 307, and they can do that using the column method of addition. That is the main focus of the chapter. Carrying on then to a sort of stretch exercise, and this is a stretch exercise in the previous chapter 6.1, which was on linking, addition and subtraction. And again, you can see I've got the same sort of ideas in there, linking all sorts of previous learning to help them retain it, to help them revisit it, and to help them make the links. So I've got adding and subtracting fractions. You can also think of those as decimals. It asks you to give the answers as fractions and decimals. We're looking again at place value of tenths and hundredths. We're looking again at fraction, decimal, percentage equivalents. And we're looking again at that idea of solving equations in equality and equivalence. And if we look at that question 4 there, that's quite a challenging one. It's not one we'd expect them to use simultaneous equations to solve, but something that you could solve using a pair of bar models as well that we illustrate throughout the books, the pictorial as well as the concrete methods of approaching the mathematics, again to give that a deeper understanding for all students. So as another example of this interleaving, in exercise 8.2, which is the chapter where we're looking at a higher step of looking at percentages over 100%, you can see there that we've brought in the idea of fractions as well. We've got equations and fractions and decimal equivalents brought into that percentages. So another one of the key things about algebra is so key to students' success eventually at GCSE. And that's another reason that we've got it there right at the beginning. They've got that groundwork of algebra, and then we have this opportunity to revisit it regularly through literally almost every chapter in the book. We didn't interleave it into constructions because that doesn't make much sense, but in pretty much everywhere else they've got the chance to really consolidate and get that deep understanding of algebra, which is key to their success later on. Similarly then, in the stretch exercise for that chapter 8.2 over 100%, we've got this question where Filippo is thinking of two numbers, x and y. He decreases x by a quarter and increases y by 20%, and then the numbers are equal. So you could see again the idea of interleaving, the mixing fractions, decimals, percentages, and then the idea that at the end we have to form and solve an equation as well, revisiting those key skills. I think what's also quite different about the Collins White Rose Maths Key Stage 3 textbooks compared to a lot of others is that the progression within topics is not just within individual chapters and within the book as a whole, but it's also between books. Okay, so moving on within the topics, as you go from book 1 to book 2 to book 3, it isn't the case that in book 3 we just assume everything in book 1 and 2, they've got that, fine, here's some really, really hard maths as well. We build on that and we revisit and we go back to it so that students can see where what is in book 3 is coming from, where it's building from their previous learning, and enable them to access it in future learning. So quite often these are specifically and explicitly mentioned either within the text itself or referenced in the behind the questions, which is the teacher guides for the books that you can get, which will provide advice as to where else you can look for further support. So as an example of that, I'm going to look in book 3 now, and the second chapter in book 3, our year 9 scheme of work, is forming and solving equations. And you can see that we start again by looking at one-step and two-step equations and inequalities first. It might be sometimes since that's been the key focus of their learning, so they may need reminders of it. And in a mixed attainment class, definitely you'll have some students who'll be very confident with these and some that won't, that need this extra practice. So you can use this with a mixed attainment class so everybody has an opportunity to succeed. I mean, the other model for this is when you've got different books and you've got a book for, lower attainers, a book for middle attainers, and a book for higher attainers. We find that's quite limited, and it's sort of saying to the lower attainers, you just do the stuff that you've done before in year 7 and year 8, and let's hope you get it right this time. But what we're doing is we're giving them the opportunity to revisit that, but then to carry on, but then to access some of the material as well that the higher attainers in the class will do. So there's something for everybody within there. So as well as those 1 and 2 step equations, we look again at equations with brackets, equations with unknowns on both sides, which have been covered as a higher step in book 2, but not everybody will have done it. Now in book 3, everybody gets a chance to look at that before we get on to some really tricky new stuff when you've got inequalities with negative coefficients. A key thing as well is we're using the same models and representations between the whole series. So it's something they're going to be familiar with. If in book 3, we're using bar models to represent equalities and inequalities, it's something that they'll already have seen in book 1 and book 2. And again, really suitable for all learners to see those links. In the same way, we don't tie it down to one particular method. Certainly, if you're using book 3 with a class you picked up in year 9 that may have come from different schools or had different teachers in the past, they may have seen different methods. So we also offer these alternatives, and we look at the balance method, we look at function machines, etc. All sorts of different ways of helping students to understand the learning that they are accessing. But it's a continuous journey that all these representations they'll have seen in earlier versions of the books as well. Again, in the Are You Ready chapter, Are You Ready section, at the beginning of the chapter, we've got reminders of all these things. Firstly, do you remember what the algebraic notation means? Do you know what inverse operations are? You're going to need to. Do you know how to multiply out brackets? Because you're going to need to do that in the equations that have got multiplying out brackets. So the Are You Ready, revisiting what's there, helping you to see within your class who is going to need a little bit of extra support with this, and who is going to be able to move on reasonably quickly. As Caroline said, the examples then we go through in detail examples. I picked example 2 here. In example 1, we're using the models and images. In example 2, I'm looking at a little bit more of an abstract way and a discussion of how that works. Going on to that practice exercise, then you can see we've got some questions on just the one-step equations to start with. And that may well be useful for everybody, or you may want some higher retainers to move on to more complex questions that are later in the exercise first. But there is the opportunity then for something for everybody in the class, which I think is why it's so suitable for dealing with mixed attainment classes. And another thing to remember as well, and based on my experience with classes, all classes are mixed attainment. Even if you're in sets, you've definitely often got quite a wide range of attainment in there, and some people will need practice and consolidation, while some people will need stretch, even if it's called set 2 or set 6 or whatever. So bearing in mind that that's true for all your classes. Again, as we're moving on through topics, here in question 3, it's year 9 now. They may well have done this before, and they may well have come across different methods. So we're showing all the different methods, an opportunity for discussion. There's that little talk symbol there to discuss that, which method works for them, which method have other teachers shown them before, etc. So really building on their prior experience. Another example there with question 4 with an equation with a division in it, noting that, if you look at Marta's method here, that in order to make it a function machine, it's really useful to swap the terms around and discussing those things. So it's really covering all possibilities and setting it so that all students can access this material. Carries on then, as you can see, into two-step equations, and then onto inequalities, and looking at the difference between inequations and inequalities. So it's good revision for everybody, but some people will be able to go through this quicker, and you will want some students to spend more time on doing some of this earlier practice. As you can see, though, the challenge does get built up throughout the exercise. So even with your higher attainers, if you want your lower attainers in the class to be looking at those 1 and 2 step equations, there is some pretty challenging material there for the higher attainers once you get as far as question 9 in that exercise, looking at what's the same and what's different between those which are all 1 or 2 step equations, but can be quite challenging because of the way they're slightly differently presented. Also moving on into the what do you think, we've got here inequalities and representing inequalities and number lines. That's something that's actually covered much later in the book. So as well as linking backwards, we do have linking forwards. So that's the what do you think is a really useful way there to think this is something that's coming up later on. So when they come to that section, so oh yeah, I remember that. Well, we did that earlier. We looked at this idea of empty and full circles with number lines. Moving on, we move on then to equations with brackets, and again, fully, clearly explained again for the students that need that, how you expand the brackets and how you solve the equation in some detail. Also supported pictorially, supported by bar models. There's a different method of doing it, that you do the division first, which is appropriate here when we've got 4 lots of something is equal to 40, because 4 is a factor of 40. So different ways and different ways of representing it, and then plenty of practice and looking again at what's the same, what's different when there are brackets, when there aren't brackets. So it's not just, a big exercise that's all exactly the same, but things that are helping students to think of whatever level of attainment they are at the moment. Then we move it on to inequalities as well a little bit later on. Same thing then, we've got consolidation if necessary. Some students may need not to get to those more challenging ones that I talked about the number 9, but to do this consolidation exercise, which is based more on earlier learning than it is on the year 9 learning. However, for the students that need that challenge, we've got stretch questions here as well. So you can see here, we're looking at an equation with 2 variables. And again, what we're doing is we're linking forwards and linking backwards. Part B of this question supports them to think about using graphs to support this. And graphs was in chapter 1 of year 9, block 1 of year 9. And also it links forwards to the idea that you've got a pair of simultaneous equations, which we solve graphically later on in the book towards the end. Again, the models and reps are there. So even when you get to that more complex idea of inequalities with negative coefficients, we're using the algebra tiles, building on the previous learning, that familiarity that will support all learners to understand and deal with this difficult mathematics, and not just, for the lower attainers, you're not doing this stuff, it's too hard for you, but we've got a way of supporting and getting them into it through the models and representations we use throughout the entire series. You can see again then for equations or unknowns on both sides, this is covered as a higher step in book 2, but in full detail again in book 3 in case the lower attainers didn't get to that bit in book 2. And again, you can see the bar models, and you can see the progression as well. It's not just here's a bar model and now let's do it all abstract. You can see the link between the abstract and the bar model, the idea of cutting things off, why these methods work. And again, we've got it compared with the balanced method as well, because some people prefer to use that one. Then we get on eventually to some more complex questions where we've got positives, negatives, etc. So there's still the challenge there for the higher attainers as well. And also when we get into the stretch, we've got some more challenging material where we've got fractions in them. We've got equations that look very similar. If you look at that 2D there, those brackets without the one on the outside, that students find it difficult to do. Things that look similar but are different. Really good things to make the higher attainers think about what difference does it make if I reverse the things in the brackets, if I reverse the signs of the inequality. Lots of discussion points for higher attainers there as well. So summarizing that then, moving on within topics, the book 1 and book 2 material is revised, which is useful for all students, but there is still plenty of challenge for the higher attainers whilst the others get the opportunity to consolidate learning. Also important, things that we do call higher strand in book 1 and 2 are covered again in book 3, so everyone gets that opportunity. We're not putting any glass ceilings there. And just a bit of advance warning, some of that is in the right final section of book 3, where we're getting ready for Key Stage 4. So for example, for the nth term of a sequence, it's not covered in book 1, higher step in book 2. In book 3, we have it here in that getting ready for Key Stage 4. So that's a new thing for some students. But for those that have done it, we've got the idea of negative sequences, and sorry, not negative sequences, negative coefficients in the terms of the sequence there in that question 5. We've got some pretty tough conjectures there in the challenging, looking at representing sequences in different ways, looking at where you'd probably normally do it more in year 12, but also comparing arithmetic sequence and geometric sequences, and even beginning to look at quadratic sequences. Again, not to find the rule for the nth term, but to investigate, and for students who are comfortable with nth term of a linear sequence to have that additional challenge in there. So key points then, summarizing, we've got progression within the exercises, we've got extra practice for those who need it throughout, there's challenge for those who need it. Prior knowledge is not assumed, but it's revisited and built on. Obviously, then you can go back to earlier books if needed. You can use questions from other books if students need even more practice of a particular thing. And I think what's really key is the consistency of approach throughout the series. So the idea of the bar models, the idea of the discussion, the idea of the think, and that thinking really helping to develop memory in there. And throughout interleaving for both support and for challenge for our students. I think that's the end of my points. So thank you very much for listening. I can see the chat has been busy. I'm going to hand over to Caroline. Any key points, Caroline, that you want to answer from the chat?
I think everything's pretty much answered. The one thing to really take away that John and Simon have mentioned, and we did also get an email about it, is just a little bit about the order that we've got in the textbook compared to the order of our worksheets and teaching slides. And the main reason for the query is the desire to use those teaching slides seamlessly with the textbook. So we know they work seamlessly with the worksheets because they were designed to go alongside the worksheets, but I do understand the frustration if you're wanting to use them with the textbook and it doesn't quite fit. I think it's something for us to take away. Myself and Ian will talk about it, but then also talk to Collins about it as well, and if there's anything we can do there to make it a little bit more seamless. But I think everything else is answered. I don't know if anyone's got any more questions.
Yeah, there was just one I picked up from earlier. It was about the worksheet. Somebody asked if the worksheets were the same as the textbook or not, and that it is completely different content. So the textbook was written independently of the worksheets, so you can use the worksheets and use the textbooks, knowing the students are looking at different things. On that point, the order is pretty much exactly the same. It's just in terms of putting it into a book, some things fit more neatly together in the chapter than they don't when you're looking at it absolutely small step by small step as you do in the teaching slides. But hopefully, everything is the same within the same block. There might need to be a tiny tweak that we need to make to some of that. One question I picked up earlier was about how much time do you assign to it, the scheme, and obviously, schools decide how much time they give year 7, year 8 and year 9. That's something that's completely beyond our control. What we've tried to do is make sure that the whole of Key Stage 3 is covered by the end of year 9. And to do that, we've split the content over 7, 8 and 9, building in chances to revisit and repeat, which also I think is an important point. There's a lot of revision of Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3 as well, and particularly in year 7, particularly this year when the year 7 may have missed quite a bit of prior learning in years 6 and 5 because of the pandemic. I think it's really important that there is opportunity to revisit the mental arithmetic strategies, the strategies for just using formal methods for addition, subtraction, multiplication, everything. They're all in book 1, which I think will be really, really helpful for those students who have got gaps in their knowledge. Yeah, in terms of time, it's always a tough squeeze to fit it in, but bear in mind that things do get repeated, both within years and between years, is what I'd say to that one.
Yeah. I think we have answered everything now. Yeah, it's been great. Thanks for all the nice comments that we've had as well.
Oh yeah, that is nice.
I think Katie from Collins is having Zoom issues. I've just seen an email come through. Oh, the other Katie. So yeah, I don't know if you want to wrap it up.
Yeah, no, just a really big thank you to Caroline and Ian for that brilliant seminar session. Hopefully everyone's got a lot out of it, and we will send the recording round to everyone who's here in the next couple of days. And at the very start of the chat, I just added a link to the resources on the Collins website, and we do, if anyone still wants to review any of the resources, then do just get in touch with us and we can arrange that. And thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye everyone.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.